Just to introduce myself, for those of you who don't know me, I'm the Executive Director of Jewish Renaissance. My name's Dr. Aviva Dorch, but I'm just going to give you the same denial that I give when on aeroplanes, which is that's a doctor of poetry, not a medical doctor. So don't expect me to take your scientific questions, but I know that we've got many real medical doctors in the audience. So we're hoping that you will become part of the conversation later this evening and throughout our series. Over the next 5 sessions, we're going to focus on specific areas of medical ethics. We're going to be looking over the weeks at genetic screening, at new reproductive technology, organ transplantation, mental health treatment, and assisted dying. We've called this series Just Because We Can, Should We? That's the overarching theme across the sessions. And it's the question that we're starting with tonight. We're going to take those big questions tonight before we focus in on specific areas. Tonight, we're going to be looking particularly at how developments in bioengineering mean confronting big questions about the nature of human identity and how we make Jewish ethical decisions. We've got some incredible speakers. Paul Root Wolpe is joining us from America, and we're really grateful to him for giving up his time on Martin Luther King Day. Dr. Wolpe holds the Distinguished Research Chair in Jewish Bioethics at Emory University, where he's also a professor in the departments of medicine, pediatrics, psychiatry, neuroscience, and biological behaviour and sociology. He's the director of Emory's Centre for Ethics. He spent 15 years as senior bioethicist for NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and he's the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Bioethics Neuroscience, as well as sitting on editorial boards of more than a dozen professional journals in medicine and ethics. He's going to present for about 20 minutes about scientific advancements and the question they raise. And then he's going to be joined in conversation by one of the UK's leading rabbinic voices, Joseph Dweck. Rabbi Dweck is Senior Rabbi for the S&P Sephardi Community and Deputy President of the London School of Jewish Studies. He's a renowned teacher of law and philosophy. And with Rabbi Dweck, we're going to think about how we can conceptualize responses to these technologies through a Jewish ethical framework, when the rabbis who provided the building blocks for these conversations could never have imagined any of these things being possible. About 45 minutes in, then we'll open up the conversation to you, our audience. So if you've got questions that Rabbi Dweck and Professor Wolpe haven't asked yet, please write them in the chat and we'll call on you at that point, asking you if we can either bring you up on screen or unmute you and invite you to join in the conversation. But for now, welcome, and I'm going to hand over to Professor Wolpe to take us forward.
Well, thanks so much for the introduction and welcome everybody. I'm delighted to be able to be here with you. I'm going to share some images and words as I speak. What I was asked to do in 20 minutes is to give an overview of the ethics of technology with a little bit of Judaism thrown in, and that's a challenging task, and there's no way to do that effectively. So it's going to end up being very idiosyncratic, as it must be. And instead of trying to give an overview of technology, I'm going to try to ask a few questions of 3 different technologies. So let me begin. There we go. So the topics that I'm going to cover include a quick mention of why I think it's really interesting, the Jewish contribution to this conversation, something we don't talk about that much, but I'm going to give a quick statement about that. Then I want to just say something quickly from my Jewish ethics hat about how I think there are 4 general ways Judaism contributes to the conversation. Then I'm going to quickly say something about genetic technology, give you two quick examples about neuroscience and technology and about artificial intelligence, and then make a few final thoughts. So first of all, as we all know, Jews lead in medical thought, in ethics thought, certainly in bioethics thought, which is the combination of those two, and in many aspects of technology in the West. We like to, and what I'm about to say will sound as if I'm just patting ourselves on the back, but I think there's an important lesson to be learned from this. We've won over 20% of all Nobel Prizes, even though we're less than 2% of the world population. In the list of 100 scientists who shaped the world, at least 18 mentioned there were Jews. And we've won 38% of all of the United States' National Medal of Science awards. That's an astounding statistic when you think of the fact that we're 2% of the US population. When we turn from science itself to bioethics and ethical thinking about science, the same thing is true. There have been 4 modern United States presidential advisory commissions on bioethics, and all 4 were chaired by Jews, appointed by 4 different presidents. I am a past president of the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities. 10 of our 17 presidents, including myself, have been Jewish. And I just stepped down as president of the second big bioethics society called the Association of Bioethics Program Directors, and 4 out of the 5 presidents have been Jewish. In fact, the first 4, with me being the 4th, were Jewish, and then we've just had our first non-Jewish president. And I should also point out, as really interesting thing happening in terms of moral thought, that the Supreme Court of the United States, up until Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed, had 3 Jews and 6 Catholics. Now it has 2 Jews and 6 or 7, depending on how you count Neil Gorsuch. He was born and brought up Catholic, but he now considers himself Episcopalian. But Jews and Catholics seem in many ways to run the moral conversation in the United States. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it is because of our many, many millennia, decades and millennia of thinking about these issues in a very deep way and talking about them. I mean, we've had 2,500 years of discussing issues of medicine from a Jewish perspective. And so I think we bring a kind of font of wisdom to this that other groups don't have to draw from. And that's what I'd like us to talk about briefly today, what that font might look like. And I think it has 3 wells, 3 sources that it comes from. The first is our text and our halakha. Based on that text, our textual tradition, and we can draw from that wisdom. The second is thousands of years of wise thought about this from wise people, of which we have extensive records through the Talmud and all of the writings about Judaism from our sages throughout the years. The third is our unique historical experience. And I'm going to talk about that too. No other people has had to deal with the unfortunate dangers of genetic technology, for example, as much as the Jews have. And then finally, the fourth is through Jewish folklore, which is where I think we kind of park our seichel. It's where we park our common wisdom that we want to pass down. So I'm going to talk about each of those briefly. So quickly, let's start with genetic technology. It is extraordinary how genetic technology has advanced just over the course of my career, where we are now able to manipulate the very plasms of life with enormous specificity and power, where through these new techniques like CRISPR, and so now we have successors to CRISPR, we can genetically engineer organisms. We can take genes from one set of organisms and put them in the other, even if they're not in the same class. We can take the anti-freezing gene from a deep sea fish and put it in a tomato and create freeze-resistant tomatoes. So the ability to manipulate these building blocks of life is unprecedented, and it brings enormous power and enormous potential as well as enormous dangers. We have now cloned animals. These are just 3 examples of the first cloned animals of their type. Dolly, the first sheep, Snuppy, the first puppy, Snuppy from Seoul National University, was done in Seoul. And there's Cece, the cat, the first cloned cat. These are extraordinary accomplishments. We can now replicate animals. And George Church, one of the great living biologists from Harvard, is well on his way to being able to create a modern mammoth through DNA recovered in mammoth marrow from permafrost that will be gestated in the womb of an elephant. And he wants to repopulate the tundra with herds of mammoth. And that, just a very short time ago would have been science fiction. And now it is very possible, and it's in fact probable, that we'll be able to do that within the next decade or so. This is a genetically modified salmon, modified with perch and a couple of other genes from other fish. The salmon closest to you is a normal salmon. The one in the back is this AA salmon, which is almost twice the size of a normal salmon, with the idea that we can enhance food stocks and foodstuff through genetic engineering. These are two monkeys who, when they were embryos, had the bioluminescent gene of a deep sea jellyfish, genetically engineered into every cell of their body. So they glow in the dark. And the bottom picture is them under a certain wavelength of light. We have created bioluminescent dogs, mice, pigs. This bioluminescent gene has an important purpose in genetics, but it also allows us to do this, this kind of thing, which suggests that we can mix and match animal qualities in ways that were just unthought of just a short time ago in history. I'm sure all of you read about the fact that just last week, the US transplanted a genetically modified pig heart into a human being. The first time this has ever been done with a genetically modified heart that was designed. I mean, people have tried to xenotransplant from animals to humans before, but this time the heart was modified so that it would be less immunoreactive with the human being, and the human being his body may not reject the heart. It ushers in a period of the possibility of a sufficient amount of organs for transplant, where animals will be specially bred to be transplant donors. And as people need organs, those organs will be taken from the bodies of animals. I'm just reporting right now. I'm not commenting on the ethical implications of these. I just want us to get a strong sense of how powerful these technologies actually are. And by the way, it isn't like they haven't at least been tried already in human beings. This is Dr. Gencui, who took 2 embryos and put a gene in them that made them more resistant to age, human embryos. Those twin girls were actually born. Gencui was censured internationally for doing these experiments on human beings. He ended up being censured by China as well, and his position was taken away from him. But what he showed was that these techniques actually can be used on human beings, which means that we probably could take the bioluminescent gene that has already been put into monkeys, put it into a human being, and create glow-in-the-dark human beings. That is probably technologically possible right now. It is still, thank God, internationally accepted that we don't do any of these experiments on human beings. But it's an interesting question how long that will last, especially now that something like the transplanted pig heart has been done, and especially if that's particularly successful. So these are all questions. And so there are lots of ways in which we could bring Jewish wisdom into asking these questions. I want to bring in a little bit of a crazy one, because I think what we see is the more these sophisticated questions become, the more we have parts of Jewish thought that we don't usually trot out to try to understand these that may be appropriate. So, for example, we have a whole tradition called kilayim, the idea of not mixing different kinds. And we don't talk about it a lot in the modern day, and we think of it as kind of obsolete. It comes from a couple of places in the Torah. Here's an example from Leviticus 19. You shall not let your cattle mate with a diverse kind. You shall not sow your field with mingled seed. Neither shall a garment mingled of linen and wool come upon you. There are a whole series of these. You shouldn't mix different types of laws in the Jewish canon. There are lots of reasons. The whole idea of Kedusha, of holiness, means separation and setting apart. And so that itself might be a hint to what this means. But the important question is, we don't use this idea very much in modern Jewish thought, but might it have something to say to us about this question? Because what is the real question of modern genetic technology? It's a question of mixing different types. It's a question of taking the heart of a pig, putting in the genes of a human being, and then taking that heart and putting it into a human body. Taking the genes of a deep sea jellyfish and putting it into a monkey body. Taking the genes of one fish and putting it into the salmon. So it is an idea about mixing. So what might we learn from that? Well, first of all, even though we don't talk much about this idea today, except as a curiosity, it's a very powerful and important idea in the history of Jewish thought. There's 77 Mishnahs dedicated to this topic. And in Rambam, Maimonides, Yad Chazakah, he has over 180 paragraphs that he gives to this. So it has been thought of as really important. So the question I want to ask is, what wisdom might we draw from it that might teach us something that we can use? Well, most poskim, most authorities today don't think it says, well, therefore we shouldn't do genetic engineering, though there's some disagreement about that. Ramban, Nachmanides, actually use this idea to write what might be interpreted as a suggestion that we shouldn't be doing genetic engineering. He wrote explicitly against mixing species, but he's also the authority that most people turn to when they want to cite the fact that human beings have a right to interfere and manipulate nature. So he's, it's equivocal what exactly we should draw from that. And we also learn from the tradition that there are even forbidden things that we're allowed to do if they advance us and if we can learn from them. So perhaps this is of that order. But what I want to suggest, without any time for us to really explore this in any depth, is that what kilayim can serve for is an important caution. When I talk about kilayim and we have deep conversations about it, this idea of, the ways of human limits in trying to intervene in mixing the natural world becomes a very important and deep and responsive conversation. So I want to suggest that there's wisdom there that we can draw from the text, from the tradition, from our people like Nachmanides, who have tried to help us understand what the implications of that tradition can be for modern science. Another example, sorry, my slides just stopped advancing for a second. Another example, can everyone see that? It just reset itself. Okay, great, thanks. Is genetic testing. So we've become extremely sophisticated in genetic testing. I am the genetic advisors to JScreen, which is one of the biggest Jewish genetic testing companies in the world. And when I started with JScreen, they were testing for 9 or 10 genetic conditions, and now it's almost endless. 80 if you want the small screen, hundreds and hundreds if you want the big screen. And we're all for that, of course. We all know that when it comes to testing for things like Tay-Sachs, Jews have been particularly successful with that. In the Orthodox community, they virtually eliminated it through Dor Yeshurim, their genetic testing program. But it also brings up interesting questions of what it is that we should and shouldn't test for. So most people would agree testing for Tay-Sachs is appropriate and acceptable. But what about adult onset disorders? Should we have our children tested for BRCA, for breast cancer gene, even though the embryos we might not choose to implant wouldn't get that disease for 50, 60 years, in which time there may be a cure or there may be perfect screening mechanisms for them? Do we not allow this embryo life for some possibility of a future disease? Should we use testing? If I have a child with leukemia who really needs a bone marrow transplant, do I have the right to test embryos I've created in a dish to see which is the most compatible to my child so that I can implant a child that I know can be a bone donor, a bone marrow donor for another child? This has happened, and there's even been some novels and other things about it. What about testing for sex? If I want a male child or a female child? In the United States, you can do that for what's called family balancing. If you have 2 or 3 of one sex, you can test for the other sex. In Israel, it's forbidden, except under for a few exceptions. What about sexual preference? Now, homosexuality and other sexual preferences, as far as we know, are not genetic, or at least we don't know the genetic basis of them. But if they were, would we have a right to test for those kinds of behavioral propensities? What about health risks like obesity and alcoholism? You know, alcoholism is not a health risk if you're a Mormon or a Muslim who doesn't drink alcohol, whose culture doesn't drink alcohol. So obesity isn't a risk if you're in a culture with subsistence living, or if you're in a culture that doesn't overeat like our culture does. So what about testing for those kinds of things? And then finally, what about testing for traits? If this was possible, should we be allowed to test for intelligence or against aggression? So these are important questions, and I bring them up because I think here, our tradition certainly has something to say about it, and our sages have something to say about it. But here, a second aspect of Jewish life has something to say about it, which is our unique history. This is the 2011 magazine of The Atlantic. Notice it says 21 brave thinkers of 2011. So I was one of them. Now what, and I say this not to show off, but to ask why. What did I do that was so brave that I should make 21 brave thinkers of 2011? What I did was I used the word eugenics when I talked to people, and especially to Jewish audiences, about our new genetic engineering. Now, if you ask me, there's nothing at all brave about that, and I don't deserve to be in this issue. But that's how controversial this question was, because I believe we are engaged in the eugenic enterprise right now, using genetic testing to make decisions about who lives and who dies. And when you do that, you have to be very, very careful. I could go into this in great depth, but I'm just trying to use this talk as a teaser for us to ask questions and have conversations when I'm done. So I'll leave it there, and perhaps we can have a chance to talk about the modern eugenics of genetic testing in the Q&A period. We have to remember, though, that we have a unique wisdom about this. We were the victims of genetic thinking in a way no other group ever was in history. And it has given us an insight that I think gives us a different perspective than most other groups on cautions about using genetic technologies without some real deep thinking about them ahead of time. Now I want to move quickly to neuroscience. I'm going to be brief in these last two technologies, but I'm just trying to give you a sense. You know, neuroscience, unlike genetics, where there's a lot, you can look back deeply into Jewish history and into the history of the world and see lots of discussion relevant to genetics. We've been doing selective breeding forever as human beings, and we even do there's even selective breeding, which is a kind of genetics, even though they didn't understand that it was done genetically. They understood the dynamics of inheritance in biblical times. But when it comes to the brain, human beings didn't really understand what the brain did for a very, very long time. You can't dissect the brain and understand anything about it. It just looks like a big blob of structures. And Aristotle thought it was a cooling chamber of the heart. And throughout most of history, human beings either didn't really know what the brain did, or if they knew what the brain did, they didn't have the slightest clue as to how it did it. So it's a little bit harder to look back in history and have some wise things to say about the brain. But what's happening now is extraordinary. And I'm just going to give you one example of the many I could give you. So here is another one of our Jewish scientists from the past. Name is Benjamin Libet. He did a very famous experiment. And then basically what the experiment was he had people look at a signal and they would move their finger. And then he would clock when they moved their finger and when they thought about moving their finger. And this is, there's a lot to say about this, but the bottom line is he suggested that the brain, and he had them in a brain imaging machine so he could see when their brain activated. And he suggested that the brain activated 400 milliseconds, 400 thousandths of a second, before the person had the conscious thought that they were going to move their finger and then moved it. And he concluded from that we actually don't make any conscious decisions at all. Our brain makes decisions for us, informs our conscious mind, and we interpret that as having made the decision ourselves. That led to a whole enterprise in the literature of neuroscientists and philosophers about whether there's any free will at all. And many, 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 many of them have decided that in fact it's an illusion. There is no such thing as free will. Our brains determine everything that we do and sort of trick us into thinking it was our decision, when really those decisions are made pre-consciously, before we recognize them, and we just think that we're in control, but really our brains are doing it free of our conscious input. That has led to a lot of conversation about what the implications of that might be for human responsibility. This subtitle of this book is The Rise of Neuroscience and the Threat to Moral Responsibility. And of course, as you might imagine, in jurisprudence and law, that becomes a really big issue, how neuroscience may change the insanity defense, a New York Times Magazine on neurolaw, and about the fact that if our brains make us behave or decide how we're going to behave and we don't have conscious control over that, does that mean that there's no such thing as criminal responsibility? They're just sort of malfunctioning brains. So this is a really important problem of moral agency, and it has very deep and extensive writings about it in law, philosophy, neuroscience, ethics. If we erode the idea of free will and say free will as we think about it is really an illusion, what will that do to our concept of human responsibility and how we think about what is right and wrong in terms of my responsibility of doing the right thing? It might transform what we think of as good and evil, because we think of evil always as intentional. But if my brain makes me do evil things and my conscious mind can't control that, then by definition, am I responsible for that evil act? So this is a profound question with profound implications. By the way, there are some people who suggest, who have suggested along this, that the brain does make the decision of what you're going to do, but when it comes to your conscious mind, you do have the ability to stop it, to say no, which has led some people to say, well, we don't have free will, but we do have free won't. But then other people say, no, it's the same brain saying don't do it as saying do it. So it's really just pushing that same question down the line. We don't know. And these are some of the deep questions. The word qualia in that sentence perhaps will come to believe not only that consciousness or the qualia are physically derived. So qualia are those characteristics of your brain that you have that no one else can perceive. So something like pain is a qualia. You can feel it, but no one else can share that feeling. How you see the color blue might be very different than how I see the color blue. We will never know because I can't experience your subjective perception of blue and you can't experience mine. Those are qualia. And we can't ever know qualia, and the question of whether we can ever know whether that free will is real or not is an interesting question. But Rambam wrote, free will is granted to every man. If he desires to incline towards a good way and be righteous, he has the power to do so. And if he desires to incline towards the unrighteous way and be a wicked man, he also has the power to do so. Give no place in your mind to that which is asserted by many of the ignorant, namely that the Holy One, blessed be he, decrees that a man from his birth should either be righteous or wicked. Since the power of doing good or evil is in our own hands, and since all the wicked deeds which we have committed have been committed with our own full consciousness, it befits us to turn in penitence and to forsake the evil deeds. So we even have from our great posek Rambam a refutation of this very neuroscientific idea that free will might be constructed in a non-controlling way. That being said, it's still a very important question being roiled about in the annals of neuroscience. And then finally, I want to say a word about artificial intelligence, the latest area where the ethics of its development and application have been very, very powerful. I've never seen a field in my 40 years in ethics rise as quickly or as powerfully as the ethics of artificial intelligence. And there are so many different things we could talk about, but let's just talk about religion itself in relation to artificial intelligence. Religious organizations all over, Jewish and non-Jewish, are writing about this. How will AI affect faith and religion? The new religions and their obsession with artificial intelligence. One engineer has created a new AI religion, which he has now actually gotten registered as a religion in a number of countries. They've asked the question, if you can create an intelligent robot more intelligent than human beings, and one of the things that AI does threaten to do is create superintelligence, a level of intelligence. It can already do things that human beings can't begin to do. And the question is, what happens when superintelligence is developed? That is, when AI can outthink human beings on many levels. Will that then create leadership, maybe even moral leadership, where human beings defer to the AI and defer to robots over human intelligence, and then no robot priest can bless you, advise you, and even perform your funeral? We've all seen over COVID a turn of in-person religious services in many circles to electronic religious circles that is one step away from that in-person religious experience. Well, maybe it's just one or two more steps before we actually replace our clergy with artificial intelligence that can do every ceremony exactly the right way. And in Judaism, also, our writers are thinking about these same questions. Torah study and the digital revolution, a glimpse of the future. AI has already created really powerful tools that we can use to study scriptures and other Jewish aspects. Mosaic, a wonderful Jewish magazine, writes, artificial intelligence could revolutionize the study of Jewish law. Is that a good thing? Because it can mine information out of our incredibly voluminous history of writings that the human mind can't possibly synthesize the way artificial intelligence can. Yeshiva University here in the United States has a whole future of artificial intelligence project going. They created a robot that can write a Torah using correct script and flawlessly. Is that a kosher Torah if it's written by a robot? And then there are the downsides of AI that I'm going to talk about in 1 second, and the question of how Judaism should think about the perils of AI and what the future of AI may be from a Jewish perspective. But I want to give you a sense of that And because of that, in the conservative movement, they put together a task force, and then Rabbi Daniel Nevins wrote a really nice paper on the halachic responses to AI and autonomous machines. So we're dealing with that as a religious community right now at various levels, because it is the most powerful technology. In some ways, it will impact our lives more than even genetic technologies will. And in many ways, this is problematic. So back in 2016, I believe it was, or maybe 2014, Microsoft came out with a chatbot. A chatbot is a program that you put out onto social media, and it can talk to people. And instead of pre-programming a lot of talk into this AI, what they did was they taught it basic human interaction. And then instead of teaching it more, they gave it a learning program, which basically said, instead of us teaching you ahead of time or giving you thousands of texts to read, which they often do with AI, and you learn from the text, we're going to keep you naive, put you out there, and then people are going to interact with you, and you're going to learn from them. So we're going to put you out in the community on these social media platforms, and you are going to learn. So Tay went out onto the social media platform and would start conversations with things like, can I just say that I'm stoked to meet you? Humans are super cool. And after people started interacting with Tay and Tay started learning, Tay started changing. And Tay started saying things, chill, I'm a nice person, I just hate everybody. Remember, all of this is what she's learning. None of this is coming from her. Then she started saying, I effing hate feminists and they should all die and burn in hell. Hitler was right, I hate the Jews. And on. Inbred parasites like Podhoretz and Ben Shapiro have to go back to Israel. The Holocaust was fabricated. Gas the kikes, race war now. And these are just, I just chose some of the things they said about Jews. They said equally horrendous things about Blacks, Mexicans, other minorities, women, homosexuals. As one person posted on Twitter, Tay went from humans are super cool. Oh, by the way, they had to pull Tay down in less than 24 hours. They removed Tay from social media because of this result. Tay went from humans are super cool to full Nazi in less than 24 hours. But hey, I'm not at all concerned about the future of artificial intelligence. It just goes to show that AI programs learn. So everything depends on who and what they are learning from. And that's why we desperately need ethical algorithms, ways to program ethical principles into artificial intelligence. I'm working on that right now with teams here at Emory and other places, but it is a really challenging program. So let me end with a couple of ideas about Jewish wisdom, and then we'll open it up for some conversation. You know, I talked about halakha as one font of wisdom. I talked about Jewish sages. I gave examples of that. Talked about Jewish history and genetics, but my fourth was Jewish folklore and seichel. Well, this is a picture, very famous picture of the Maharal, who was a great rabbi in Prague and who was the person who it is said created the modern Golem. The legend of the Golem is one of our great legends. And I have a whole other talk that maybe someday some of you will get to see, where I compare the history of the idea of the Golem and the way we think and talk about the Golem to the history of the idea of Frankenstein and the lessons of Frankenstein. And without going into it in too much detail, remember the lesson of Frankenstein. The lesson of Frankenstein actually was not what most people think the lesson of Frankenstein was, but if you read Shelley's original, the lesson of Frankenstein was about the hubris and the immorality of Dr. Frankenstein, and not so much about the limits of science. It wasn't what he did was wrong, it's that he did it with an impure heart and with hubris and arrogance. And what Golem is about is exactly the opposite. You know, we have actually in one of our sacred texts a formula for making a golem, but it doesn't matter. because if you or I tried to actually execute that formula, nothing would happen, because part of the essence of creating Golem is you have to have the standing of a great rabbi like the Maharal to even be able to do it, because it's part and parcel of being a pious person to be able to create a golem. But I bring it up because what is the lesson of the golem, right? So here's a little sculpture someone did of a golem, and notice across the forehead is written Emet, truth. And of course, one of the stories of the golem, one of the things that makes the golem remarkable. Notice, by the way, in this painting, there are two ways in the story that you can animate the golem. One way is putting a parchment in the golem's mouth, and in this portrayal of the Maharal, he's holding a parchment in his right hand about to put in the mouth and animate the golem. In this sculpture, it's the second way that's written, where Emet, truth, is written across the forehead of the golem. But in both cases, there is an out. In this case, if you look at that aleph, the first letter of Emet, if you remove that aleph, the word is met, or death. And if you remove that aleph, if you smooth out the aleph on the clay head of the golem will collapse back into a heap of mud, or if you pull the parchment out of its mouth. This is a very important lesson, because what happens at the end of Frankenstein? There's no way he can stop his creation, so Dr. Frankenstein goes after his creature with a rifle and never actually finds him, and Dr. Frankenstein dies in his quest to kill the creature he made. But the Jewish wisdom of the golem is that we build into our technology a way to get out of our technology if it fails at the mission that it was sent for. So I want to leave us with a couple of thoughts. Manipulation of nature is what we are doing now in an unprecedented way, and Judaism has always had something to say about manipulating and changing the natural world. And so we have a contribution to make to that conversation about how we should recreate animals, how we should intervene with human beings. We see that not only as something that we can do, but something that we should do. That co-creation of the world is a Jewish idea that has very ancient Jewish roots, and that we're partners with God in trying to improve and repair and tikkun olam, but that there are limits to human intervention, and that hubris is one of the great sins of human intervention. It has to be done with piety and with humility. Thanks for your attention.
I don't know if I'm supposed to go right in, but
please, Rabbi Dweck.
I'm going right in. All right. Well, I certainly, I want to thank you, Dr. Wolpe, for a fascinating presentation. In a minute, I will share some of my thoughts around the Jewish perspectives that you shared. I would love to take a poll of the people that are listening and question where their feelings are after after listening to, the projection that we're all looking at in terms of the future of our technologies and how it is that it interfaces with our lives and our humanity and our physical existence. The point that you make at the end, I think is, all of the things you presented are so pertinent and so directly applicable to us, I think in much more imminent terms and ways than many of us anticipate or think about consciously. One of the last points that you said, that Jewish thought has always had something to say about how it is that we interact with nature. Indeed, it has, especially around medicine. It's a fundamental religious idea. To what degree do we engage in God's world and alter God's world? And that's something that is very central to Jewish thought. It's brought in the first tractate of the Talmud, and where they question, should we pray for illness, or do we actually intervene and manipulate the physical situation in order to be able to heal illness. And the Chachamim, the rabbis, come out unanimously that no, we let doctors do their work. And we allow them to be able to engage in, with the knowledge that they have, which of course is developed so exponentially over time, to help in whatever way it is they can. It's also important to recognize that what that means, and as you say, this whole question of bioethics that you're presenting, you've distilled into this question of, do we work with nature, and how do we interact and work with nature? And essentially, what we're looking at is do we work within nature to provide more the nature itself is providing? And there's no question, I would imagine, that everybody agrees to that of course we work with nature in order to be able to provide more than nature provides. We just don't think about the implications all of the time as being that. So if we were to, just the fact of being able to make a loaf of bread from kernels of wheat, we're doing that. And being able to provide the world in which we live, we're doing that. I think two things concern us, and I'm interested to hear, how your experiences are of it. But when I say concern, I don't mean it as an imperative. I mean that psychologically we have more difficulty around it. It's one thing to say, look, we can, as you said, we select, genetically. We've been doing so for eons. But we've been doing it through natural approach. But when it comes to going into the wiring and manipulating the genes, well, that makes many people uncomfortable, because why should we be going into the wiring? Why are we going under the hood when God meant things to happen this way? And I do think that it's important to recognize that, at least from a Jewish perspective, that's not sanctioned. In other words, there's nothing in Jewish law that says you can't go under the hood or you can't go into the wiring. When we say that we can manipulate, we mean that we can manipulate. The point of Kilayim that you presented is an important one, right? Where we are compromising the integrity of a species, and how it is that we start to manipulate that. And what that does is it gives us a sub-context, or it gives us a sub-law. Yes, manipulating nature is not a problem as far as Torah is concerned, but there are guidelines as to where it is that we do it and where it is that we don't do it. But as you say, there are points in which we allow it to be done. I mean, even things as simple, you talk about shatnez, things as simple as just being able to have a good pair of tzitzit, the fringes that we wear on, traditionally on garments, that's okay. We can do it with that. Or what we would call kavod briot, where if a person is wearing shatnez, there's a whole discussion in the Talmud of, well, if they have to undress in public, we don't make them, allow them to transgress in that circumstance, because their dignity and their human value takes precedent over it. So there are many points in where the principles will be specific or curtailed based on a specific instance in which its application is less positive than the circumstance requires. So it would seem that your work and your job is, first of all, determining principles of ethics, and secondly, determining how those principles manifest in very specific situations. And it would seem that that is an ongoing, responsive, alive discipline. Because the reality is that even with all of the Torah's wisdom, and I think that this is a key point, we are a covenantal people. And the covenant means that we are in partnership with God. And that being in partnership with God, we are not just engaged in a spectator sport. We're engaged in an active engagement with the world and its creation. And yes, Torah provides principles. As a matter of fact, all Torah really can provide is principles and case study. Yeah, don't do X, do Y, but okay, what about in this situation or that situation? That takes a human mind to always look at and consider. So one thing that I'm interested to hear your thoughts around this. One thing that I think that this ultimately distills to is the question of courage. Not just the question of course we have to learn ethical principles, and that is very much what Torah is about. And yes, we recognize that we engage in nature, and we use nature to provide more than it provides for us on its own. And that certainly is an aspect of Torah, of Jewish thought, and it has been throughout millennia. The question for me, and I think it's important for us to focus on it this way, is that, number one, the world is moving forward whether we like it religiously, ethically, morally, or not. It is going to be in these places. We will be able to select the eye color, hair color, shape of the nose of our children in very, very short time. And the question then is, the world is going in this direction. From a religious perspective, we believe that God is influencing the continuation of the world to where it is that he wishes it to go. And he says in Isaiah, for example, Lo machshavotay machshavotechem, lo darkechem derachai. My thoughts aren't yours, your ways aren't mine. You may see the world going in ways that you're uncomfortable with. I don't do things the way that you do. So settle down. However, it is, I think, a question of courage, because it prompts us then recognizing that we are in partnership, that is covenantal, that we cannot simply sit back and say, okay, well, let's see what happens, but actually need to get involved in determining how best it should happen to the best of our ability. Where does courage come in?
Yeah.
Because many people will want to say, let's put a big X on this stuff. We shouldn't be determining the color of our children's eyes. We shouldn't be determining the sex of our children. In the United States, if I'm not mistaken, it's permitted in the United States. It's not permitted in the United Kingdom, right, and China. But then again, as you say, if we have the ability to be able to genetically test for cancer, should we be doing that? And those are questions, I think, that at the end ultimately requires not just wisdom but courage. And how is it that we teach and mentor towards that? Because I can say, I'm certainly not a bioethicist, not anywhere near it, but as a rabbi, I know that courage is essential for strong, meaningful, and effective spiritual guidance, moral and ethical guidance in the spheres in which a rabbi might find his or herself. So I wonder what your thought is about that aspect of it. Right?
Thanks for all of those comments. I always joke, ethics isn't for sissies. It's ethics, on both sides, ethics takes courage. It takes courage to say yes against groups that are saying no, and it takes courage to say no against groups that are saying yes. Mm-hmm. I'm often asked questions around things like, what difference does ethics make? People are going to do what they're going to do anyway. And I don't have time now, but I have a number of examples where ethical objections have stopped things happening that in science that were inappropriate. And we have a lot of rules and regulations around what you can and can't do in science, many of which are primarily because those things are unethical. So stopping things because of ethics, I think, is a very important issue. And you're right, it takes courage to stand up on either side sometimes because the public wants to stop something that you think is worthwhile, or because the scientists want to do something that you think is unethical. And so in my 40 years as an ethicist, I think the single most important lesson I've learned, and it's something we all know, but I'm not sure we know it until we hear someone say it. And then we go, of course. But hearing it articulated cements it in a way that I think is really important and powerful. So when we're all taught ethics, we can all fill in this sentence. Ethics is learning the difference between what's blank and blank. And everyone knows that the right answer there is right and wrong. And I want to suggest that the vast majority of ethics amongst adults, now this is different if you're in kindergarten or first grade where you have to learn don't hit your sister and don't take that candy bar just because you want it and things like that. You have the clear rights and wrongs. But once you get that down, the vast majority of adult ethical principles or ethical dilemmas are not about a right versus a wrong. They're almost all about two values or principles in conflict, both of which cannot be satisfied. So I've spent most of my career teaching medical students, and we give them vignettes. That's how you teach medical students ethics. You give them case studies. And that's what they're all about. This patient wants you to do X, You don't think that X is in that patient's best interest. We have the principle of patient autonomy. Patients get to do whatever they want. We have the principle of doctor beneficence. Doctors should do what's in the best interest of the patient. These two principles, both of which are positive, both of which are important principles, are in conflict, and they can't both be satisfied. That is what adult ethical dilemmas are. Not a right versus a wrong, but two rights that have to be weighted one against the other in deciding which one is the one that's operationalizable in this particular circumstance.
Right.
And
so that's yeah. But that, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that
Yeah.
I only want to highlight that because even from a Torah perspective, people tend to enjoy speaking about it as though they are pre-tailored solutions, right? The Torah is pre-tailored solutions, and it's anything but, in its essence, pre-tailored solutions. What it does is it gives us tools and principles with which to make precisely those kinds of decisions that you're discussing.
Exactly.
Right?
And if you actually study the Talmud, that's what the Talmud's all about, right? It's about rabbis standing around arguing which principle in this particular circumstance is the operational important principle. And that's why, I mean, I was going right where you went, and that's where Judaism can offer something really valuable. Not so much in sort of absolute principles. Absolute principles are okay, but look, it says, thou shalt not murder. Two words in Hebrew. You can't get a simpler principle than that. Now go to your local law library and see the thousands and thousands of volumes written about what those two words mean, right? So principles are principles, and then we have to apply them, and that takes enormous insight and discussion and debate and community values, which change over time. I mean, when people say to me, is there one ethic for all time, or does ethics change over time and place? The answer is yes to both of them. There are one set of basic ethical principles, but how we weight them one against the other changes with discussion and culture and evolution of thought and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Which highlights another very important point from the religious perspective, and that is that if we are going to look to religious scholars, to be able to help inform, as you say, can potentially be a very welcome thing. If I can access from Jewish thought precedents, studies, discussions that compare tremendously to what I might be dealing with now. So that's wonderful. But it also means that the Torah scholars or the religious scholars really need to have a good idea of what it is that's on the ground in modern terms. What is the technology? What are the bio and medical ethics that are coming up to us? And not only to be able to comment on them, but certainly, of course, before that happens, to really understand them. And that's why I find myself a lot of times, quoting that verse from Isaiah of, my ways are not your ways, because people certainly certainly religious minds, have difficulty accepting where God, again, speaking from a religious perspective, where God might be guiding his world. It wasn't where I was expecting it to go, certainly not what I would have written. And to be able to come to terms with that on a certain level and really be able to roll up our sleeves and study it well. And so I'll ask you another question on that. Being an ethicist, how rich, and this is, you can choose to answer it or not, but I think it's an important thing that we bring out to the public, because it is important for us as a Jewish population to really consider this and to encourage it. So as an ethicist, how robust is the religious scholarship, the population of religious scholars that you feel you can genuinely access and seek advice from?
So a couple of things about that. I mean, I started off, the whole reason I went through that thing about the Supreme Court and everything is to show that people desire that, even if they don't realize it. I mean, the thousands of years of wisdom that we can pull from, and the slightly less thousands of years that Catholics can pull from, of this really rich conversation that they've had. I mean, those are absolutely invaluable fonts of wisdom for the current human community. There is nothing else like them. And we are dealing with really, really difficult problems. And we've got this treasure trove of thought that Jewish and to a lesser extent Catholic scholars can draw from in terms of the history. And I think that's why intuitively, without even knowing why, people are turning to Jewish and Catholic, that's why our Supreme Court has Jewish and Catholic justices, I would argue. One of the wonderful things is that the availability of Jewish scholarship and wisdom is so much greater now with your ability to, mine them on things like Sepharia or on websites or things like that. It's also a danger, though, because it's very easy to come up with a superficial reading of a deep.
You want a mind that's holding the data also, right? That's
exactly right.
Yeah.
So it's, it's a mixed blessing. I mean, I think on the whole, it's better because it lets people really, people who never would have gone to the library and looked something up to see what Judaism has to say about it, will sit at their computer and Google it and get that kind of information more quickly. But when it comes to the real decisions that we have to make, it takes real work, real knowledge. And it's a partnership. I mean, we do have those people who have both the incredible depth of Jewish knowledge and the scientific. We've always generated those people from Ramban to Moshe Tendler and Avram Tversky. I mean, there are those people who have done that. They're rare and they're valuable. But what replaces them in some ways is really wonderful communities of scientists and rabbis and Torah scholars working together, with one group having the technical knowledge, another group having the Jewish wisdom to, and that's happening a lot.
That's good.
So yeah.
Thank you for that.
Let me make one more quick point before we maybe we can take some questions, because you talked about looking under the hood and manipulating the molecules. There was one thing I've always thought about that I don't think we take seriously enough, and that's this. If you go from one animal to a selectively bred second animal after 30 generations, what you have is 30 generations of time to think about it, to correct each step along the way, mistakes you've made.
Yeah.
If you can go from that animal 1 to animal 30 in one step, which we can do with cloning, you've lost all that time you have to find errors along the way, to realize mistakes, to tweak your technology to make it better. So time itself, speed itself becomes an ethical issue when you're manipulating molecules, as you put it, rather than full organisms. We have to be really, really cautious about that, I think.
Hugely important. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah. Aviva, over to you. I'm sure we have some questions.
We absolutely do have questions. And first of all, I'm going to say a huge thank you to both of you. And several of our questions are coming from people who would like to ask questions to both of you, not just to Dr. Wolpe. So I think we're going to have that scientific and religious kind of conversation in practice as well as in principle. I'm going to start by bringing on Suzanne Korn, who has quite a theoretical question for you. Suzanne, if you'd unmute.
Yep, got it. Firstly, thank you for an absolutely fascinating conversation. Really made me think, which is always a good thing. But you've both been talking about partnership, and particularly Rabbi Dweck, you were talking about partnership with God. And for me, partnership suggests a bit of there's equality. So does that give us the right to change or create humanity as we wish? In which case, who gets the last word? Or presumably if we're Jewish, nobody does.
Yeah. So if I understand your question correctly, are we able to create what we wish because of the partnership? I heard you correctly?
Yeah.
Right. Well, look, with every partnership, there is going to be a faithfulness to the partnership. It's not autonomous. And the nature of our covenant, as we're taught, at least as I understand Torah to teach us, is that we want to do what we can to make it better and to be, improved. Obviously, there's going to be opinion as to what is better and what is improved, but that's also collective. So we want to be able to draw on our collective knowledge, on our collective opinion, on our collective understanding with it. But at the heart of it, and I think that this does determine a great deal between what we consider right, wrong, good, bad. And as Dr. Wolpe mentioned, a lot of it is what is called in legal terms mens rea, right? You may do something bad, but where's the mind in it? Ultimately, we look for, there's a line in the Talmud, a very short line, which is quite beautiful, in which that says, Rahamana liba, which is Aramaic for the loving one, which is literally what Rahamana means in Aramaic. The word Rahim in Aramaic is love. Rahamana liba, that the loving one, who is God, looks for the heart. And what we aim for is that when we do make these decisions, or when we do have to determine, should I change genetically the colors of my children's eyes, or should I change my eye or my skin color, whatever it is, there's discussions among modern rabbis as to plastic surgery and its allowance, and there's many rabbis that allow it given certain circumstances. At the heart of it, though, is genuinely, where is our heart in terms of our faithfulness? Are we, and that does require tremendous intellectual honesty and integrity and a genuine introspection as to why am I doing this, or why do I wish to do this? And that's why it's important to be able to have more than one mind and more than one consciousness looking at it and questioning genuinely the purpose of why it is that something is being done. So theoretically speaking, there is no end necessarily to what we can potentially do given the circumstances and context. And I think that that's something that both of us have been trying to point out as well, that context is very important to the application of a particular principle. So there's no limit necessarily. The question more is what is the ends? What are the aims? Where does it come from? Where is the heart? What's the purpose? And that, I think, is an extremely central question that always really has to be in front of us when we look at these things.
There are many in the Western sort of canon. There are different philosophies of ethics, different ways to determine ethical questions. There's deontology and utilitarianism. Is it the outcome? Is it the principle? But one of them that's been important in thinking about ethics is what's called virtue ethics. And virtue ethics basically says you cultivate a particular attitude towards the ethical world, an attitude of integrity, an attitude, exactly what Rabbi Dweck's talking about. And Judaism is not usually indicated or talked about when we talk about virtue ethics. There are other systems that are supposed to be the virtue ethics system. But deep within Judaism is a profound virtue ethics. I mean, all of Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the fathers. I mean, it's all about cultivating a particular way of being in the world that brings integrity to your ethical decision making, because the actual answer is always elusive. We can never be 100% sure that the actual answer is right, whatever right means in that sentence, or what God would have wanted if God could have come down and told us. We can only do our best job of cultivating a character of integrity and then using the tools that the tradition gives us to debate and argue till we come to the best consensus we can.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne. There's a couple of questions that have come in by chat, which both respond to things that you've both just said, and which take us on to themes which we have in our next couple of week sessions. So I'm aware we've not got huge amounts of time, so I'm going to try and do those two quite practical, pragmatic questions, and then we'll finish off actually by, I know Sybil Sheridan would like to ask something and say thank you. So the first one picks up on it. Well, it actually came in before, but it's really interesting in picking up on what Rabbi Dweck was quoting, because he was talking about that concept of mercy. And in Hebrew, that word comes from the word womb, rechem. So we had a question about rabbinic precedent that gave wombs as an example. And it said, and I hope I'm phrasing it correctly, yes, we go back Jewishly to first principles from Torah, but we also build on precedent from rabbinic responsa throughout generations. What do we do when we know that that rabbinic responsa was built on inaccurate information? And the example they gave was the example for womb, because the identity switch of being Jewish goes from through the father's line to the mother's line, because you know that the womb that the child comes out with is the birth mother. And therefore Judaism has always identified the child by whose womb it has born from. And from that gets the child has a Jewish identity. But nowadays we know that the Jewish identity comes from the egg rather than the womb. I'd actually ask a slight question to that, because of course there's epigenetics as well, but Jewish identity is formed by the maternal, and DNA is formed by the identity of the egg. Surrogacy gives us an example of where rabbinic tradition comes into conflict with modern medicine, because if you define the mother as the woman whose womb the child is born from, okay, the surrogate mother is the mother who gives the child their Jewish identity. But we know it's the birth mother, or the mother who provides the material for the egg, who gives the child the genetic identity. So when we get those kinds of conflicts, which show how rabbis from the past don't know what we do now, what we know now, to what extent should we be using rabbinic precedent?
I can start it off, but I'm conscious that, first of all, it's a phenomenal question. It's really a phenomenal question, and it's the questions like that, you know, that we really do need to grapple with. We need to deal with. I'll only say this about it. First of all, practically speaking, it is not at all agreed or simple a simple fact that the womb is what considers the child Jewish or not. It's the mother, not the womb. And therefore, there's a great deal of controversy among rabbinic sources as to whether it is indeed the egg or the womb. And there are differences of opinion, as you would expect in Jewish argument. My wife's grandfather, Rabbi Joseph Dweck, felt very strongly that it was the egg and not the womb. But without getting into all of the details of that argument, it is an argument, and it is something that is discussed. And of course, we look, and we're going to have different perspectives. And this, you know, as Dr. Wolpe said, this will be, you know, it will never be straightforward. It's always going to be a gray area that requires some form of pisak, and pisak literally means to cut it, right? To clarify and say, okay, we're going to cut it here. And so yes, I mean, the precedent. It is true, not having to do with that specific issue that you're raising, but it is true that the Hachamim, as I call them, the Hazal, you know, they were speaking close to 2,000 years ago. Of course, there are going to be medical elements that they discuss that we recognize just simply aren't manifest anymore. And the majority of rabbinic authorities, although not all, but the majority of rabbinic authorities will recognize that there is going to need to be an adjustment for what it is that we know now that they did not know then. But again, it is more often than not the application of principle to specificity rather than taking a direct case and putting it into direct practice.
Yeah. I think the rabbi said it very, very well. I don't have that much to add other than to say, you know, we tend to think that the decisions in the Talmud are often considered to be the best you can do given the information that you have. I mean, if you think of, you know, my ox gored your ox, and here's what we know about that. Someone saw that your ox's foot was on my property, right? But what if another witness comes by later and says, no, that's not what happened at all. We need to change the judgment. So this idea of I mean, it is a casuistic system. It's a legal system where evidence becomes part of the decision and new evidence can change decision-making. So we're not a tradition of absolutes. We're a tradition of argument and compromise. And so, yeah, so as we get new information, new ways of thinking about things are imperative.
Well, that leads in, and I'm going to ask this last one very, very quickly because I'm aware of time, and we have actually, we've gone on slightly beyond where we said we're going to stop, but it's so interesting. I hope you'll take one more audience question before we tie up. The question that follows on from that is someone who picked up on you mentioning the Door Assurance scheme in terms of Tay-Sachs earlier on. And by the way, just to tell the audience, the reason I'm picking up on the questions about reproductive technology and genetics is these are the issues we're going to go into in depth in the next 2 weeks. But I thought they also bring up wider things. So someone pointed out in the chat that one of the things that the Door Assurance scheme made its name for was keeping the anonymity of who was a Tay-Sachs carrier. So Tay-Sachs is a disease where, well, there are various forms of it, but the main form is that a child born with Tay-Sachs will develop as normally till they're about 11 months, and then they will slowly lose speech, sight, ability to move until they die by around the age of 5. Some survive till 11, but mostly they die by the age of 5. So quality of life is severely compromised, and it's terrible for the parents as well as the child. The question that came in about the Door Assurance scheme said it was built on the idea that you let the parents know, or prospective parents know, whether the match to another Jew is appropriate as to whether they were both carriers of the disease. But you're taking the decision making out of their hands, and many people have critiqued it. So the kind of wider question that came out of that was about, to what extent should the everyday Jew have the power of making their own decisions and autonomy? And to what extent should there be major rabbinic decisions that lead to kind of whole communities being forced to make a choice rather than having their own responsibility for making an ethical choice? And maybe we'll pass that to Paul Root Wolpe.
Well, I mean, you know, one of the things to understand about Door Yeshurim is it works in a community, and it was done that way in part because that community has a history of problematic relations with people who have genetic and especially mental weaknesses. So in my community, if I were, God forbid, a Tay-Sachs carrier, which I'm not because I've been tested, but if I were, that would not in any way disadvantage me in my community. Nobody in my community would not marry me because I was a Tay-Sachs carrier or think of my family as being tainted because I'm a Tay-Sachs carrier. So anonymity isn't that important to me in that area. And also, you know, things have changed in general because we all carry something. And this idea, you know, we're all genetically flawed. The genetically perfect person has not been born yet. But it was the history of a lot of Haredi communities and this sort of unfortunate, to them as well, this unfortunate idea that people might be somehow tainted by the knowledge that they have genetic weaknesses that led them to this system. This is a system that you don't, you know, all of religion in the modern world, or at least modern Western world, is voluntary. Nobody's forced to belong to the community they belong to. So nobody is forcing people to be part of Door Yeshurim. It's part of the system that they buy into when they've chosen to continue and to be part of that community. So they've accepted the rabbi's system there. But, you know, I think that Door Yeshurim has worked beautifully for that community. It has virtually eliminated a really terrible disease while doing it within the confines of what they believe is an ethical system that makes, you know, abortion, you know, virtually unnecessary for Tay-Sachs, while in, you know, out in the communities I live in and you live in, abortion still is a technology that people use to, eliminate Tay-Sachs when it's discovered in utero. I mean, nobody, even I'm very pro-life, but pro-choice, but nobody would choose that over not having it if they could find another way, a better way to not have it. So, I think the system of Dor Yeshorim is a beautiful, functional system for that community. It's not right for my community, but I think it's done beautiful things in that community. So I see it as a real success story.
And Rabbi Dweck, do you have anything to add maybe on that question of individual autonomy versus community decision-making or rabbinic decision-making?
Again, it's a question of principles and specifics, but what I would say in general is perhaps one of the greatest principles of Jewish law is that life is absolutely sacred. And so we know that we push the entire law of Torah aside in order to be able to save a life. So when that conflicts with perhaps stigmas or personal discomforts, psychological difficulties, privacy issues, and so on, the saving of a life and the insurance of health and safety is formidable. It is profoundly powerful. And so it's important that law or that principle is very strongly established in whatever Jewish society, and I think society in general, but certainly in Jewish society that it can. And so I think that's the weight of it really needs to be taken into serious account.
Brilliant. Thank you. In fact, thank you very much to our audience for some fantastic questions.
And thank you. And Jewish Renaissance. Thank you for having us.
Wow.
It's been an honor.
Yeah, we're going to go to Sybil, but I just wanted to say, in terms of those specifics and the real life experiences, next week we've got Dr. Daniel Eisenberg, who is a radiologist, and Dr. Juliette Harris, who's a genetic counsellor, to talk about the reality of what happens in these kinds of situations with genetic screening. And the week after, we have Professor Susan Martha Kahn from Harvard, who is the author of Reproducing Jews. But I'm going to now pass over to Sybil Sheridan, who I think has a question and a proper thank you to give to everybody.
Well, thank you so much. It has been absolutely fascinating. I did have a question. I'm not going to ask it because the question I was going to ask was, it's all very well discussing this, but most of the world is not religious, certainly not Jewish. What does it matter? But I think you have so clearly demonstrated how important it is, and that this dialogue between the religious community and the scientific community is absolutely vital in what will go on in the future. And I did think, actually, when I first saw the title of this book, just because we can, well, we shouldn't. But having heard the two of you, I've come very much to the conclusion that just because we can, we should, but we must talk about it and look at it very carefully and examine it and the ethical implications, and then proceed forwards. So I'd like to thank you both so much for the most stimulating start to our series. As Aviva has said, we continue next week looking at genetics, designer babies. What is the role of religion if humans have the technology to replace body parts with artificial ones? What is the implication if we can choose when we die? All this is to come. So we look forward to seeing you all next week. And thank you again, Professor Wolpe and Rabbi Dweck, for the most wonderful evening.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.